Hello there, welcome back. I'm glad you joined me. Today we're going to talk about the informed consent. We're going to talk a little bit about the document. We're going to talk about how consent is obtained from participants, and then we're going to talk about some tricky situations because it oftentimes does not go exactly as you plan. So just as a reminder, we have some ethical principles that we use to guide all of how we interact with study participants, but the principles also apply specifically to the consent process. And you're going to remember these when we talked about the Belmont Report. Autonomy, which means allowing individuals the ability to make decisions for themselves, and that includes giving them enough information, fully informing them so they can make a good decision. Beneficence, which is doing no harm. We'll talk more about beneficence throughout the semester. We'll talk a little bit about it in the study protocol, but making sure that the risks are minimized. And then justice, making sure that we fairly distribute the burden of clinical research across all of society. So a few key points about the consent form. This is a refresher. You already remember this, I'm sure. But the IRB is required to approve the consent form itself. Now, you've likely signed a consent form for a procedure, maybe in the doctor's office. Maybe you're going to go and have a mole removed. And you'll have a consent form to sign. This is different. This is the IRB does not approve those kinds of just routine medical care consent forms. We're talking about the consent form to participate in a clinical trial. So the IRB is going to want to approve that. There are 8 required elements. The language has to be understandable to the individual participating. That means language-wise. So I am unfortunately not bilingual. I wish I was. So I only speak English, so I would have to have a consent form in English. Also, you have to take in consideration the educational level of the participant who's on your trial. So most consent forms will be written in a grade 6, 7, somewhere around there, reading level. And in the consent form, one of those required elements is you cannot waive any legal rights from the participants. So whatever legal rights are afforded to people on the trial, they cannot be waived as part of the process. And you have to bear in mind that revisions may be necessary. So once the IRB approves the consent form, they, at some point in the future, might need to review and approve a revision. So a very common example is that the adverse events change. So the risks of participating in a trial change the more people you have participating in trials. So the adverse event profile on a phase 1 study changes a lot by the time it gets to a phase 3 study, because a phase 1 study you have maybe several dozen people participating, but by the time you get to phase 3 you might have 3,000 people participating. The more you expose individuals to that drug, the more adverse events you find. So that's a really good example of when a consent form might have to be changed, is if new adverse events become known, because that autonomy principle that we talked about, you want to make sure that the individuals have as much current information as possible to make a good decision. So you might have to change the consent form during the life of a study. So here's a sample consent form. I found this on the internet. And this would be very common. This is for an epidural, some type of pain reliever. Consent to the administration of local anesthetics, narcotics, and other medications into the epidural space. And in this case, you'll see at the very last bullet point is fetal distress from one of the complications. So this is done during childbirth. And so this would not be uncommon for you to find in a hospital. Now, if you took this form, now the IRB form will get a little bit more into the content, but if you were to take this language to the IRB and say, hey IRB, this is exactly what the risks are we want to tell our patients, the IRB is going to say, why are you using such big words? So the idea here is, if you were to give this consent form to a physician who was in labor, she would totally understand this. If you gave this to another woman with a terminal degree, a PhD in English literature, obviously a very intelligent, well-educated woman, these words might not have a lot of meaning to that person. So it's not necessarily educational level so much as it is trying to find language that would be understood by a large group of people. So I took this sample consent form and I made some changes to it. And I changed all the words that I changed, I put in green here if you wanted to go back and forth to see them. So I took out all the very large words in the first one, which was at about 10th grade reading level, and I changed them down to this, which is a 7th grade reading level. And so your IRB would be much more likely to approve this revised sample consent form, simply because the language is understandable to a lot of people. So there's the consent form. Remember, we talked all about those regulations a week or two ago, but now we're going to we talked about the form, but now we're going to talk about the process of actually how do you get someone to participate and sign the consent to be on your clinical trial. So there's some very important key points that you want to bear in mind. You have to give people sufficient time. That's part of that autonomy principle. They have to have the time to think about things, and everyone's different. What is sufficient time? Some people are really fast and they make decisions very quickly. Me personally, I like to sleep on things. So you have to give someone enough time to know that they've made a good decision. In a lot of practices, especially in phase 1 and phase 2 trials, or trials that are exploring terminal illnesses or other incurable illnesses, more time is necessary. You might want to give sufficient time, extra sufficient time for studies that have a lot of risks in them. So sufficient time can mean sending the patient home to consider it and then coming back. But sufficient time is not written into the Code of Federal Regulations anywhere. This is just how your practice does it that's the best way. You have to answer questions. The more questions that participant has, the more engaged they are, and the better prepared they are to make a decision to be on a trial. Personally, I get concerned when participants don't have a lot of questions. To me, that means they are not fully either understanding or they're not fully considering what participating in a clinical trial might mean to them. The process really has to be non-coercive. Now, I have never seen anybody, twist someone's arm to participate in a clinical trial, but what I mean by non-coercive means you really have to allow that person to arrive at their decision however that's best for them. So if a good example would say a participant says, my husband isn't with me today, or my husband's out this is a good one, my husband's out in the waiting area and I would like him to be part of this conversation. That's not allowing that husband to be there would be a little coercive, right? So the participants will tell you sort of how they're going to make their decisions and what information is important to them. Sometimes asking if they have a family member that they would like to be in the exam room during the consent process can be helpful. So it really has to be done entirely in the best interest of the participant making the decision. And then, really important, and actually this is in the Code of Federal Regulations, a copy of the signed consent has to be given to the subject. It doesn't have to be the signed one. Signed consent is best practice, but the subject should always have a copy of that consent form with them. And here's why. They're going to go home and they're not going to remember some of the important things. The consent forms are very long. That sample consent form I just talked about does not really reflect the length of a consent form on a clinical trial. I have 2 consent forms that I have posted in this module for you to look at and get a better idea. But when you give them a copy of their consent, that gives them an opportunity to take home information with them, because they're going to get home and somebody in the family is going to ask them a question. They have the consent form they can go back and reference. So that's really good. Also in the consent form required by law is who to contact in case of an emergency. And that's really important for the participant as well, and to tell them that there's that contact information in there. So those are the key points to actually the process of having someone consent to be on a clinical trial. So then there's proof of practice. So you do all these wonderful things. You give them lots of time. You have the family with them. And you give them a copy of the consent. How do you prove that you did all of these things? The key is to write a progress note which details the process. If you didn't write it, you didn't do it. Now, I have a memory for things. I could remember when I go home at the end of the day that there was a participant X that signed a consent form. But you have to write it down. A, someday you're going to win the lottery and quit working, or you're going to retire, or you're going to go work somewhere else. So the progress note is your written record of what you did, and it demonstrates that you understand the consent process. The original signed consent form has to be maintained, and when I say maintained, I mean kept and stored at the research site. You're going to give the participant a copy, but you yourself as a research coordinator are going to keep the original one. This is another proof that that participant signed the consent form. Here's a little trick that I used to have. I always used blue pens when participants sign a consent form. The blue pen doesn't copy well. It copies as a black pen unless you have a color copier, and most places don't want to spend the money on it. If you have a black and white copier, you can tell instantly the original copy from the photocopy, right? The blue ink is your indication you have the original one. You have to organize your study documents nice and neatly so that you can find that original consent form easily. Your study monitors, the FDA, anybody who comes in and audits or inspects the study, one of the very first things they're going to want to see is the original signed consent form. So these have to be maintained so you don't lose them. You lose them, it's really bad, because then you've lost your proof that that person consented appropriately. And most importantly, you have to remember that the informed consent is not a single finite event. The informed consent is really a conversation between the investigator and the participant about being on a clinical trial. Now, up front, when they sign that consent form, you can say that was an event you could see. But the idea behind the consent process is that you're having a conversation and you're informing the participant about risks, potential benefits, those kinds of things. So in that respect, you're going to continue to communicate with the participant about things. They might have to sign another informed consent if it's revised. If there's a revised consent form, they'll have to sign the new one at some point in time. But the whole idea that there's an exchange and there's communication is what makes it an ongoing event. So I'm going to give you some tricky situations. This is the first one. These are real things that have happened. A woman who routinely visits your clinic is an ideal candidate for new trial, speaks no English, and she relies completely on her adult son for assistance when there are no bilingual medical staff available. Your principal investigator, the PI, wants to enroll her, but the consent form is available only in English. What do you do? Remember, the law says this has to be in a language she understands. One option that sometimes people think of is to rely on her adult son. And you could rely on her adult son to read the English consent form to her in her native tongue. That actually would make sense on a practical note, right? She relies on him when she goes to the grocery store, maybe, when she has to go to, a government office, get a driver's license. She's going to rely on him, so why couldn't she rely on him in this situation? Well, I wouldn't really advise for that, because unless you are bilingual, which I am not, I don't know what the son is saying to her. I don't have any way to be able to verify that his English skills are good enough to be able to translate this consent form into her language. So I'm not really going to be comfortable. He's wonderful, he helps her, but in terms of participating in a clinical trial, I don't have any way to verify what his language skills are like. So I don't know what that exchange is exactly. In this case, I am going to ask the IRB to approve a consent form in her language, whatever that might be. Now the PI might say, Heather, I don't have time for this, because it's going to take maybe a week or two to get this approved by the IRB. And the principal investigator, he's a kind of get it done kind of guy, and he might put a lot of pressure on me. He might want me to go ahead and use the sun. But I'm going to stand my ground on this, and I'm going to explain to the PI that this is what needs to be done on this trial in order to do the right thing. And I'm going to explain to him that the Code of Federal Regulations requires that it be in an understandable language. And then I'm going to work with my IRB and my sponsor to get the English consent form translated into her language. So that's what I would do. There are going to be times as a research coordinator that you have to really know what your job is. And even though we know that the PI delegates to me as the clinical research coordinator, I still have to know what the right thing is, and I have to be firm sometimes. So that's what I would do. I would have it translated. Another one. Your site has recently enrolled a 64-year-old male in a study. After answering his questions, he signed the consent form and enrolled, but he's returned unscheduled today because he has questions about the instruction on his pill container. In the course of discussion, it becomes clear that he is illiterate. What do you do? And this actually happened to me. This gentleman had been illiterate obviously all of his life, and he came with his wife and son to sign the consent form, and they were very informed and had very good questions, and I had no reason to believe that perhaps he was illiterate until he returned about 2 days later. Obviously, for individuals that are illiterate, there's a lot of motivation to sort of hide that, right? There's a lot of stigma associated with that. So he didn't want to say to me, hey, I can't read. He could sign his name. I believe his son read, if my memory is correct, read the consent form to him. So he was knowledgeable about things. But this was a once in a 100 years kind of situation. So what did I do? I actually called the IRB. I called my IRB, which at the time was the Health Science Center, UT Health Science Center, and I said, IRB, please help me. What do I do? And you can call your IRB, especially if you have an affiliation with an academic IRB. The IRB, remember, are sort of the ethics police. They want to make sure that everything is done in the best interest of the participant. So the IRB will help you. Even though I use the term police, they're very approachable. And so I did. I called the IRB, and they helped me to figure out that I needed a short form. So they walked me through exactly what to do. I had to document some things. We'll talk about a note to file in a little bit. But I did. I worked with the IRB because I had never had this happen before, and they were extremely helpful because the IRB and I both wanted to make sure that this participant was not being taken advantage of because he couldn't read. Another one. Patient returned today because he's going to sign the consent form. He was given a copy last week to take home and review. He comes back, he states he didn't read the consent, it was too long, and he isn't interested in reading it right now. He states that he simply wants to enroll in the trial and has already made up his mind. What do you do? Well, there's nothing in the Code of Federal Regulations that says the participant has to read the consent form, right? There's nothing in the law that says what the participant has to do. But you know that if he doesn't read this consent form, he really won't know what he's getting himself into. The fact that he told you he didn't read it and he's not going to read it puts you in sort of an awkward situation, to be honest with you, though, because it would not be in the participant's best interest to let him sign the consent form without knowing what's in it. So at this point, I think a heavy-handed way would be to say to him, I'm going to read this to you, because no one likes that. No one likes to be treated like a child. So I think that the way to do this would be to sit down, and again, there's nothing in the Code of Federal Regulations that says how you do this. I think I would sit down with him and I would go over the consent form page by page and talk about all of the bullet points in there, and then give it to him and ask him to read it again, and tell him that you really aren't going to allow him to enroll in the trial without reading this consent form. I think that there's a certain amount of people skills that you need to be able to manage a wide variety of participants that you're going to find. And this is a good example of a situation where you have to be persuasive, and you have to really talk to this man to figure out, again, maybe he is illiterate. Maybe this is another example of an illiterate patient, but you have to sort of figure out and talk to him and figure out what's going on. All right, so now your study, another situation. Your study has a newly revised consent form as a result of some serious adverse events. So lots of risky things happening here. Many of your subjects have completed the trial and are no longer making routine visits to the clinic. Your PI tells you not to worry about the subjects that recently completed the trial and simply reconsent the existing subjects. What do you do? How does that sound to you? I actually think that sounds like a really good idea. Now, let me give you a caveat here. If the serious adverse events are acute, meaning they happen quickly, they come on suddenly, and they're related to the investigational drug, then I think that would make sense to really simply reconsent the existing subjects. Now, if those serious adverse events are latent, in other words, they don't show up for 3 to 6 months after dosing, then that would be an important consideration, because even though the subjects that have completed the trial are no longer making a decision about whether they should be in this trial or not, it's over, they might need to know these adverse events might pop up 3 to 6 months, maybe a year later. In that case, I would contact those older patients that are already off the study to make them aware that these adverse events might happen. They're no longer on the study, so they're no longer consenting to anything. They've completed everything that they needed to do. But in that case, you might want to make them aware of things that could happen, just as a part of educational outreach. So I think for me, my question would be, tell me more about the serious adverse events. If they happen quickly, a case of hives, then I think then simply reconsenting the existing subjects would be fine. If these are long-term things that happen, then yes, going back and making the older subjects aware would be important too. So there's always questions you can ask to help you sort of guide how would you handle this. Lots of tricky situations. Anytime you put participants in a clinical trial, they get very interesting. And I will tell you, it's the participants that make working as a clinical research coordinator sort of fun. And here's our last tricky situation. A potential patient has returned today to sign consent for a low back pain trial. Due to her symptoms, she was given a narcotics injection upon arrival. Very bad back pain that day. She states that her pain has significantly improved in the last 30 minutes. She appears loose, alert, and lucid. She's about to sign the consent. What do you do? My first question is, what kind of narcotic did she get, and is she in a position to make an informed decision 30 minutes after the injection? She might appear alert and lucid, and but I want to make sure that everybody who signs my consent is not operating under the effects of narcotics, because it does impair decision making. And so I think there would have to be some discussion between myself and the investigator who sees her about whether she's impaired from her narcotics injection. At the very latest, I would like to wait another 30 minutes to an hour before I'd have her sign the consent. But that is definitely something that is important to know for things like low back pain trials, cancer trials where people are taking a lot of pain medication. So that is a consideration for someone who's signing a consent form. So that would be my question to the investigator, and that would be my my worry. And honestly, you could have a monitor that would come in and look at that this woman got an injection and sign the consent form 30 minutes later, because most consent forms are timed, and that could create a lot of questions between you and the sponsor. So always, we have our reference as the Code of Federal Regulations, can't live without it, and then our textbook. Please let me know if you have questions. I enjoy, I put the tricky situations in there because I enjoy all the different scenarios that can come up. So if you think of something and you have questions, please let me know. I'd love to talk about it. In that case, I will talk to you later. Bye-bye.